Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Chris Boudreau. I'm Manomet's Donor Relations Manager, and I want to thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation, Feathers in the Flint Hills, Shorebirds in the Grasslands. We've got a fantastic webinar for you tonight, and in just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Monica Iglecia, who's Manomet's Assistant Director of Shorebird Habitat Management, and Dr. Robert Penner, who's the Avian Program Manager at the Kansas chapter of the Nature Conservancy. But I do want to highlight just a few things before we begin. At the bottom of your screen in your toolbar, you should see a box marked Q&A. If you don't see it, use your mouse pointer to hover over the bottom and it should pop up. If at any point during tonight's presentation you have a question, just click on that Q&A box, tell us your name and enter it. Abby Sterling, a shorebird biologist at Manomet, is going to be monitoring the questions to make sure we get an answer for you. And if you're unable to stay for the entirety of today's presentation, it will be recorded. So look in your email inbox here in the next day or so for a link to the recording, which you can watch on demand or share with others. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Monica and Dr. Penner.
Hey everybody, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday. We are very excited to talk with you about shorebirds in the grasslands and about how these birds are moving through the Flint Hills of Kansas and Oklahoma. So I'm Monica Iglecia. I work with Manomet, and I am actually based on the West Coast in California. And we have Dr. Robert Penner with us today. Robert, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course, I'm Robert Penner. I work with the Nature Conservancy. My actual long title is Cheyenne Bottoms and Avian Programs Manager, which means I oversee the management of the Cheyenne Bottoms Preserve here in central Kansas, but I also do avian programs work, which now, lucky me, is all about shorebirds. And so I get to work with partners like Monica and Abby and Chris. And I want to say that it is a beautiful evening here in central Kansas. And the only reason I would be inside is to talk about shorebirds.
Thanks, Robert. We also have Abby joining us. Hey, Abby.
Hi, I'm Abby Sterling. I work for Manomet down in Georgia on the Georgia Bight Shorebird Conservation Initiative. So I only see birds on beaches, really. I don't get to see birds in grasslands. So I'm excited to be here with y'all tonight.
Great. Well, thanks so much. So for everyone, really our hope is that you leave here today really inspired by these beautiful birds and with this increased understanding about what it takes for them to survive and the importance of this beautiful region in the Flint Hills. So with that, we will get started. So I love this photo, and as you can tell, this bird has a band on its leg, and like many banded birds, once they have been banded and they're released, they seem to disappear from human notice. They become essentially a needle in a haystack. But if you're lucky, that bird will persevere, and maybe sometime in the future, somebody's going to see it, and it might contribute to our understanding of their species. Last summer, Greg Kramos, who's a private lands biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, won the shorebird jackpot. He saw this upland sandpiper perched on a fence post in the Flint Hills. And he very patiently and very diligently photographed this bird until all those tiny unique numbers on that aluminum band could be read. And then guess what? He found out that this bird was banded by researchers on the Kansas Prairie Biological Station, which is a field research station right in the Flint Hills of Kansas. And when he saw the bird, it was just a mile away from where it had been banded in 2006 when it was a chick. And it was banded by a researcher, a scientist named Brett Sandercock. So that means that this individual bird is over 13 years old, and it makes it the oldest known upland sandpiper on record. Now, clearly the Flint Hills are an important place for that individual upland sandpiper, But before we get into this rolling landscape of the Flint Hills, we're going to zoom out a little bit for a larger context of birds and shorebirds. So unfortunately, and as many of you may know, we're in the midst of a global biodiversity crisis. So much so, in fact, that there's this name for this new unofficial geological epoch, and it's called the Anthropocene. And this epoch is characterized by a world influenced by people. So much that our human activity is having a significant impact on the planet, on its climate, and on its ecosystems. And those changes are being seen in bird populations. In 2019, a study was published in Science showing that some of these really dramatic declines in bird populations in North America since 1970. They estimated that there are 2.9 billion fewer breeding birds today than there were in 1970. Unfortunately, shorebirds are not immune to these declines. Among native species in North America, shorebirds as a group have undergone some of the most significant population changes since 1970, and they have the highest proportion of species in decline. So in this figure, the x-axis is the percent of population change since 1970. And so any colored bars that are on the left of 0 indicate a population decline, and anything with colored bars on the right of 0 indicate a population increase. So what you might notice is at the bottom, that waterfowl, which is a bird group that includes ducks and geese, their populations have increased over time, or since 1970. And this is really exciting because this gives us hope. So this is a sign that significant investments in conservation actions that are focused on bird groups and habitat improvements can actually make a positive difference. And that's what we're seeing in that waterfowl group. An assessment of shorebirds in Canada found that while shorebird species as this group have declined by 40% since 1970, it's the shorebirds that are migrating very long distances that have declined even more steeply. They've declined by 52%. And the shorter distance migrants are also declining, but they've declined by a little bit less, by 23% over the same time period. But overall, these trends are pretty scary. And really, these population trends and declines are the drivers of our conservation efforts to protect and to conserve shorebird populations and their habitats. But some of you might be asking, what is a shorebird anyway? So shorebirds are part of a large order of birds called the Pteridriformes. And these birds are generally characterized by longish legs and bills, but it's a super diverse group. There's 5 families that breed in North America. And if you happen to have a favorite shorebird, please feel free to share it in the chat box so we know which ones are your favorite. But the sandpipers are the most diverse family. They include the smallest shorebird in the world, which is the least sandpiper, and also the largest shorebird in North America, which is the long-billed curlew. Then there's the stilts and avocets. They're made up of these tall and graceful shorebirds like blacknecks. Well, they are the blackneck stilts and American avocets. Then there's the plovers, which are much shorter in stature, and they're characterized by having large eyes that they use because they're visual hunters and they're looking for prey items in the mud and sediment. Then there's the oyster catchers. Those are on the bottom left. They're coastal species, and they're really an unmistakable family. They have these large, straight, red-orange bills that they use to pry open bivalves. And they have relatively thick pink legs. And then there's the turnstones, which have relatively short legs and this powerful wedge-shaped bill that they use to turn over stones and to pry things open. You may know this shorebird. This is one very adorable bird that made its Hollywood debut in Disney's Pixar short film Piper. And this was a little film that brought shorebirds to the main stage, got everybody pretty excited that as this young little bird faces its fear of the ocean and overcomes challenges. If you haven't seen it, I do highly recommend it. But you may not know that Piper was modeled after the sanderling, which is a species that most people think of when we think about shorebirds. And it's possible that because of this, a lot of people expect that shorebirds can only be found on the beach or on the shore. But that's not necessarily true. So while many shorebirds are commonly found walking around or wading in shallow water, shorebirds can also use inland wetland sites like the Great Salt Lake in Utah or Cheyenne Bottoms right in Robert's backyard in Kansas. And then, of course, this is what brought you here today. This is a small group. There's a small group of shorebirds that need wide, open grasslands for the majority of their life cycle. And this is the group of shorebirds that we're going to be chatting about, and it includes species like upland sandpipers that nest in and migrate between areas that are dominated by grasslands and prairies. So most shorebirds are migratory, and their annual life cycle can be separated into 3 distinct periods: breeding, migrating, and non-breeding. So for shorebirds in North America, the annual cycle looks a lot like this. There's the breeding season during the warm summer months at northern latitudes. There's a southbound migration during the fall months that's followed by a more stationary non-breeding period that could be as far south as the southern tip of South America in Tierra del Fuego. And then there's the northbound migration back again to the breeding grounds, all happening within a year. And 71% of all the shorebirds in North America actually nest in boreal and Arctic regions, so at northern latitudes. So for example, this is an American golden plover, a species we'll be talking quite a bit today, and it nests on the Arctic and subarctic tundra. And this video was collected by my colleague at Manomet, Shiloh Schulte, while he was doing some research in the Arctic. So there's some characteristics about shorebirds that make their conservation quite challenging. Many shorebird species, as we talked about, they're some of the most migratory animals on the planet. And so protecting them takes a large effort across an extremely large geography. So that means that protecting the important habitat for a single species might mean working with communities across many countries. But shorebirds also provide us with a unique opportunity, an opportunity for diplomacy, to learn about new cultures and other people in other places, and an opportunity to bring us all together. Another challenge is that shorebird species tend to group together in big numbers at a relatively few locations across the Americas, and that makes them susceptible to any changes that might be occurring at these sites. And shorebirds only lay a few eggs in each nest, ranging from 1 to 4 eggs, depending on the species. And so that, coupled with the fact that about 1/3 of North American shorebird species have fewer than 25,000 individuals in their populations, that puts increasing pressure on ensuring the survival of these species. So in the Americas, these birds are moving between breeding areas in the north and non-breeding areas in the south, and they're generally moving along these broadly defined flyways that link breeding and non-breeding places together. Some species only migrate short distances, while others migrate very long distances. And then there's some species that don't only migrate north and south along the same exact pathway. But in the Americas, these flyways are the Pacific Flyway, the midcontinental here in yellow, and then the Atlantic Flyway in pink. And so to help conserve species in the Americas, there's been some flyway-wide conservation strategies developed in both the Atlantic and the Pacific Flyways. And this is where conservation partners across many countries are working together to outline the actions that are needed to address the specific threats that are occurring and impacting shorebird populations in individual flyways. So the midcontinent flyway strategy is currently in the beginning stages of development, and both Robert and I are working with many of partners to help develop this strategy. Kansas is within the midcontinental flyway, and that's roughly bordered in North America, or at least in the US, on the west by the Rocky Mountains and on the east by the Appalachians. So the midcontinent in North America has more shorebirds using both the northbound and southbound migration periods than the other two flyways. During fall migration, so southbound migration, about 2 million shorebirds actually return to their wintering grounds further south following the Atlantic flyway. So this is something we actually see with shorebirds. It's an elliptical migration. So in the case of the midcontinent, many shorebirds are going north up through the midcontinent and then heading south along the Atlantic. But really, no matter how you look at it, the midcontinent is an extremely important place to shorebirds. And North America's midcontinent it's not only host to migrating shorebirds, but 18 of the 44 species that use this region actually nest here. They're nesting in the prairies, along the coastlines, on the edges of islands and freshwater and saline lakes. And some examples of species like this are the extremely charismatic American avocet on the left. They nest on the edges of shallow marshes and ponds and in saline wetlands and lakes. Or the fluttering spotted sandpiper that nests in vegetation next to wetlands or alongside river edges. And then while more than half of the shorebird species that use the mid-continent of North America do migrate very long distances, there's a fair number in this flyway that are actually short distance migrants, like killdeer, which we'll be talking about a little bit later today, or marbled godwit. This is a large shorebird with a straight, slightly upturned bicolored bill. And this species breeds in the Canadian prairies and makes a reasonably short migration towards the Pacific coast, where it winters in the San Francisco Bay out towards me, and at sites a bit further south into northern Mexico. And the shorebirds that use the midcontinent are not immune to population declines that we're seeing in other bird species. More than half of the midcontinent populations are showing long-term declines. And for 11% of the species, we actually just don't have enough information to know what direction that trend is going. So there's 6 shorebird species that have more than 90% of their population passing through the midcontinent. That includes Hudsonian godwit, short-billed dowitchers, white-rumped sandpipers, stilt sandpiper, semi-palmated sandpiper, and buff-breasted sandpiper. Now, while nearly the entire population of buff-breasted sandpiper pass through the midcontinent region, it's highly likely that the majority of these individuals are passing through Kansas specifically. And then when we look at species that have between 70 to 90% of their populations using the midcontinent, each of these 7 species occur in large numbers, specifically in Kansas, either at places like Cheyenne Bottoms or the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, or in the case of this jewel of the prairies, the American golden plover that relies very heavily on the Flint Hills. Now we're going to turn it over to Robert to dig into the Flint Hills.
Thanks, Monica. Now, while these shorebird numbers that Monica was just talking about is impressive, they are but a fraction of what they once were. Indeed, the grasslands that these shorebirds and many other wildlife species rely on also is but a fraction of what it once was. The vast prairie ecosystem once dominated the mid-continent landscape, stretching from southern Canada to Texas. The tallgrass prairie seen here in the light green has been reduced to just 4% of the original acreage. The Flint Hills consists of 6.3 million acres in Kansas and in Oklahoma and is a stronghold for this important habitat. The region is dominated by gently rolling hills of grass, which has largely been protected from cultivation due to a layer of rock known as flint lying just below the surface. As such, this region is well suited for grazing. Ranching in the Flint Hills has been going on for hundreds of years. Ranching is a very important part of the economy of the region and for the state. With 98% of the Flint Hills under private ownership, and most of that is ranches, ranchers are key to conserving the Flint Hills. A common grassland management practice in the Flint Hills is annual burning. Providing fresh, lush grass increases livestock weight gains. This burning creates large expanses of freshly burned or black areas that are highly favored by a group of grassland obligate shorebirds, such as the American golden plover, which surveys exhibit that nearly 30% of its entire population may pass through the Flint Hills. This is truly a long-distance migrant that travels north through Kansas and the eastern United States. But as Monica said earlier, the majority actually follow the East Coast on their return trip to South America. And then there's the buff-breasted sandpiper, in which over 30% of its population has been recorded in the Flint Hills. This allows us to designate the site as a Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Network landscape of hemispheric importance. In fact, over 50% of this species' entire population has been recorded passing through the Flint Hills, according to surveys. But as Monica said earlier, it is quite possible that close to the 90% of its entire population passes through the region, making this area extremely important to the survival of the species. And we'll talk more about this species a little later. Like the American golden plover and the buff-breasted sandpiper, the upland sandpiper is also a long-distance migrant. While they nest in the area, a large number are also just passing through during migration. With a population estimate of nesting birds in the Flint Hills around 40,000. And even the killdeer, considered a short-distance migrant, passes through the region to breeding grounds in the north. Yet some remain to nest, and if they actually do leave Kansas during the winter, they don't go very far south. Still a common shorebird that is found in many habitats, during the Flint Hills shorebird surveys from 2011 to 2018, over 12,000 were recorded during one spring. But I'll be honest with you, it's quite possible that we actually undersurveyed these guys because we were actually looking for buff-breasted sandpipers and American golden plovers in recently burned pastures. The Flint Hills Shorebird Survey was an 8-year project from 2011 to 2018, which resulted in 5 major findings. Migrant American golden plovers and buff-breasted sandpipers are more common in the southern portions of the Flint Hills. They use areas with a high proportion of native grass. They occur more often in grassland landscapes that are less developed and have few trees. They primarily use grasslands that have been recently burned over compared to other low structure habitats. And the majority of migration is between April 15th and May 10th. Variation in migration stopover use among years was influenced indirectly by precipitation and grass growth, and directly by the amount of burning. Because of the clear importance of the Flint Hills to multiple shorebird species, there was 3.7 million acres within the larger Flint Hills landscape that was designated as a landscape of hemispheric importance to shorebirds in 2016. Now, the Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Network, or WISRN for short, is a conservation strategy for shorebirds in the Americas. These 107 sites in 17 countries are today part of the Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Network, meaning that they are very important to shorebirds because they either host a large number of shorebirds or a significant portion of a certain population of shorebird species. These are also places where communities have made commitments to conserve the species that use these sites. WISRN is made up of hundreds of partners, but its executive office is at Manomet. So what attracts shorebirds to the tall grass prairie? It's actually the short grass. In general, shorebirds prefer to feed in areas in which the vegetation is less than half the height of the bird. And for the majority of species, they prefer to feed in sites with less than 25% vegetative cover. Freshly burned grasslands provide this short and sparse vegetation. and also provides for easy access to freshly roasted invertebrates, which are essential to their diet and to their need to replenish their fat reserves for those species that need to continue their northward migration. But even later in the migration period, those areas that were burned a few weeks earlier still provide the desired habitat needed to feed and rest before moving on. And for those species like the killdeer and the upland sandpiper that might stay to nest, this is also favored habitat. But annual burning or frequently burned areas lead to a scarcity of residual nesting vegetation for grassland birds. And also a loss of heterogeneity, with annual burning favoring grasses while slowly eliminating many forb species. Since about 1985, intensive early stocking combined with annual spring burns have become extremely popular in the Flint Hills. Now, intensive early stocking simply means twice the many cows for about half the grazing season, roughly about 3 months. Frequent or annual burning is done in large part to increase average daily gains of cattle. As we can see from this graph, the 10-year average net returns are significant. When you have early intensive stocking with no burning, you get about $6.61 gain per acre. But if you spring burn and early intensive stock, you get $13.36 per acre return. This is a huge incentive to early intensive stocking and spring burning for ranchers. So when you consider the advantages of annual burning for cattle production versus the negatives for wildlife and grassland health, what do? Well, what we're trying to do is to promote managing to mimic historic natural burning and grazing. Patch burn grazing is a management technique that will meet these goals. What is patch burn grazing? Well, as this cartoon says, it's a crazy experiment where we can get weeds or forbs and short grass and tall grass and birds and cows all in the same pasture. So as an example, here at the Tallgrass National Prairie Preserve, using natural breaks such as trails or draws, we cut out 1/3 of the property for burning, and then we burn it. And so a little bit later in the season, you get these picture down below that on the right shows it recently burned, where on the left side is something grass from last year's growth. Then we move to another 1/3 and we burn that. And so your grasslands are going to look like this, kind of short, sparse vegetation compared to what was burned last year, where it's going to be taller and thicker. And then finally, we burn the third section. Now, there's huge advantages to patch burn grazing. For example, when you burn an area, the cattle are really going to be attracted to this. So you're going to get heavy grazing in this 1/3 patch that was burned. And so the grass is going to be bare to short in that area, which is highly favored by such species as the horned lark, the buff-breasted sandpiper, and American golden plover. Whereas the 1/3 that was burned last year is going to be medium grass, and so it's going to be moderate grazing. And so that's kind of right in the middle of what greater prairie chickens like. And then finally, without burning for 2 years, you're going to get tall grass, which really is liked by the Henslow sparrows. So again, on the top, we see what it looks like when it's burned and grazed the given year versus 2 or 3 years later. So with patch burn grazing, you get a mosaic of vegetation heights and densities, which provide a wide range of habitats for grassland birds and other wildlife. So there is huge benefits to grassland birds such as this buff-breasted sandpiper on the left or the upland sandpiper on the right, and to short-eared owls or the eastern meadowlark, Henslow sparrow, and of course the greater prairie chicken. Another great advantage is that it helps to maintain a healthy grassland ecosystem by providing 2 years of partial rest for grazing sensitive forbs like butterfly milkweed, sensitive briar, coneflower, and compass plant. Now, by not burning every year, you can build up greater fuel loads, which means hotter, more intense fires, which have a better chance to control woody vegetation. Without some method to control woody vegetation growth, there's going to be more trees and shrubs that can take over your grasslands. Now, although this is a really pretty picture, what we actually see here is much less acres available for grazing and much less desirable to even useless for shorebird stopover habitat. Now, something that most people don't think about, but it stands to reason, that there's less smoke produced when you burn only 1/3 of your property. And this is actually significant because given the fact that thousands of acres may be burned every spring, this puts large amounts of particulates into the air, which settle on metropolitan areas to the north in both Kansas, Nebraska, and even Iowa. This places a burden on these cities to meet clean air standards. So without a reduction in smoke during springtime, it's quite logical that eventually legal and government action may come into play. In fact, burning this spring might have been shut down due to concerns about how it might affect COVID-19 situation. For the rancher, another great advantage is that there's going to be leftover forage on the unburned side in case you have a cold, wet spring or even a drought. And it's much easier to count and doctor your cattle in these large pastures because the cattle concentrate in the 1/3 that was burned. A new management technique that is gaining acceptance in the region is bird burning to control an invasive plant known as Sericea lespedeza in late summer or even early fall. Spraying of this invasive plant has been the main control technique. But late summer or early fall burning has exhibited success in controlling this plant. The time frame for burning almost directly aligns with the fall migration of buff-breasted sandpipers. Now, GPS tagging results, which have been conducted for a number of years by Rick Lantot of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Lee Tibbetts from the U.S. Geological Service, show that buffies that pass through Kansas come through in August. So fall burning at this time of year has the potential to increase stopover habitat for this species. And if you also graze in the fall, it's almost assured that the short grass habitat that these species desire will carry over into spring migration. Now, I have to admit, shorebirds using these fall burn pastures is just a hypothesis. We don't really know if that's going to happen. So it would be very appreciated if for you that might be birding in the Flint Hills this fall, especially in August and September, let us know if you see shorebirds, especially in those recently burned pastures. Now, I got to be honest, there is a perception that patch burn grazing is just too complicated. such as there is a need for fire breaks within the pastures rather than perhaps along the edge where you could use roads for fire breaks, or you might just need more equipment. Plus, it is just different, and it may take a little courage to do something different out on the landscape. But this management technique can provide weight gains on cattle, maintain the health of the grasslands, and provide habitat for wildlife. So the benefits outweigh the negatives. Fire has helped form the prairies, and it is an important part of maintaining these grasslands. But we are losing species, and this requires changes in the way we manage our world, and it can be done in a way in which there's a place for all living things. Now I'm going to send it back to Monica to wrap up.
Thanks, Robert. So it's really exciting to learn about some of those land management practices that can benefit grassland shorebirds in Kansas, but it's also important to think about what's going on south of the border, where these birds are going for the winter. And really, whether it's in North America or South America, there's a really important role that private lands can play in shorebird conservation, no matter where that is. So we can look at the wintering area of buff-breasted sandpiper that Rob described earlier as an example of how connected we are to our South American neighbors. So buff-breasted sandpipers spend the winter or the non-breeding season in the prairies or the pampas of Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. And so much like the prairies in North America, nearly 70% of the grasslands and the savannas of South America have been fragmented, converted for human uses, or otherwise lost. And this is a really biodiverse region. It's home to more than 400 bird species and approximately 100 mammals. And that includes the black and white monjita, which is a flycatcher species on the left-hand side, and the pampas deer, which we have a fawn leaping in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And in the southern cone of South America, just like in North America's prairies, ranching is a really significant and important economic driver, and also a cultural staple. But there, overgrazing has led to soil erosion. It can lead to the expansion of invasive species and can lead to the loss of native wildlife. And there are additional threats in the region, including the conversion of these grasslands to soy, corn, and wheat agriculture. But there's exciting programs that are happening in these regions to improve those grasslands for both birds and people. The Alianza de Pastizal, or the Southern Cone Grasslands Alliance, is a program that started back in 2006. It's made up of governments, nonprofit organizations, and ranchers working in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And they're working to improve the conservation of grasslands in South America. And participating ranchers have made commitments to using responsible grazing practices and by limiting the use of agrochemicals. They have these annual meetings that help foster an exchange of experiences and information across both the producers, the managers, and the researchers. And this whole program is really founded on the idea that well-managed grasslands can offer stable and predictable income. It can preserve an important regional culture. It can help to conserve our remaining grasslands. It can protect soil runoff, and it can protect species from extinction. Sort of like a win, 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 win. And one of the pilot projects that occurred there was in Laguna de Rocha in Uruguay. And this is an area that, like the Flint Hills, it's also a Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network site. Laguna de Rocha hosts more than 6% of the global population of buff-breasted sandpipers. So in collaboration with partners, the National System of Protected Areas in Uruguay put together this introduction of best practices for ranching in protected areas, and it's aimed at the conservation and maintenance of the biological diversity of the area and promoting different management practices, like identifying the ideal stocking rate by having rotation cycles and rotating the livestock into different areas to create the appropriate habitat that's needed for buff-breasted sandpipers and for American golden plovers. So grazing has the ability to be both a threat and a management tool across the Americas. but when managed in conjunction with the needs of wildlife, it represents an opportunity to expand the conservation of natural grasslands and the species that are reliant on those areas. So this is a photo of American golden plovers that are actually on their wintering grounds on a private ranch called Estancia Medaland in Argentina. And this is another site within the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. And this photo was taken by a colleague, Angeles Borrero, in Argentina. And really, it looks very similar to something one might see in Kansas or in the prairies. So from Kansas to Argentina, these beautiful shorebird species are connecting us all across the Americas. And of course, we want to end here on that 13-year-old sandpiper in the Flint Hills, because now that you know the incredible distances that these grassland shorebirds can fly, we can tell you that since this bird migrates from its nesting grounds in the Flint Hills of Kansas to the grasslands of Argentina and Uruguay every year, that this over 13-year-old bird has flown essentially the equivalent of flying around the world 6 times. It's pretty impressive for a little bird standing on a fence post that one might not even notice. And so there's a lot of things that you can do to help protect and conserve shorebirds. And Sylvia Earle, who is a famous marine biologist, she has a quote that says, "You cannot protect what you do not know." And so our hope is that we have helped you know a little bit more about shorebirds here today, and that this really is just the beginning of your journey of learning about this beautiful group of birds. We hope you also understand that the places that shorebirds go are immense, but that the actions that are happening in specific places are the actions that will help species conservation happen. So some of the ways that you can help shorebirds are to participate in webinars like this, but you can also become a citizen scientist. You can go out and observe shorebirds and count them through programs like the International Shorebird Survey. And by doing so, that contributes to our knowledge of the population trends for shorebirds. As Robert mentioned, you can help us if you happen to be in the Flint Hills area and doing some birding in the fall. Let us know if you see shorebirds using burned fields in the fall, because we're trying to get a better understanding of this newer management practice on the landscape. You can stay informed about what's occurring locally and beyond with respect to shorebirds. And for those of you that are interested in contributing in other ways, both the Nature Conservancy and Manomet, we are nonprofit organizations, and we are driven and are able to function based on the support of donors. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening. Some of the support for this work was in part made by the Bobolink Foundation and the Band Foundation. And we are really excited that you are all here, and we'd like to open it up to answer some of your questions. So Abby's going to help us field some of those questions, and we will do our best to answer them.
Great. Fantastic, Robert and Monica. This was really wonderful. We've got some great questions coming in, and to folks that might be listening, feel free to keep them coming, and we will send them on. One of the first questions that we got from Dan Rogers was just curious about burning in the Flint Hills, if it has any detrimental impacts on ozone levels or bird nesting activity.
Well, yeah, so in regards to bird nesting activities, that is one of the reasons with annual burning that things like the greater prairie chicken, Henslow sparrows are species of great conservation concern. Both of those species with annual burning, they don't have the thick, lush grass and litter layers that they require for nesting. And of course, anytime you put particulate matter into the atmosphere, you're going to affect the ozone layer to some degree. One of the things we're promoting, in addition to patch burn grazing, is actually to burn at different times of the year. And this is actually really beneficial to the prairie anyhow. Not all fires naturally were in, April and May. They occurred probably more times during the summer during lightning storms. So to have a really healthy prairie ecosystem, burning at different times of the year is actually great advantageous to the health of the, not only the grasslands, but to the grassland birds that nest there.
Great. Jim Walton asked if y'all know what the response of ranchers and the Kansas Livestock Association has been to patch burn methods.
The Nature Conservancy is partners with the Flint Hills Grazing Land Trust, the Ranching Trust, all these different trusts. And the problem, you know, I didn't go into it, the problem with patch burn grazing, it is a little more difficult to do. And so it's slowly gaining acceptance. And I think as time goes on, hopefully that will continue to grow. But it's a tough technique to do patch burn grazing, but we are seeing more and more of that happening in Flint Hills.
Great. Monica, this one might be for you, coming from Marian Iglecia. She's curious why the buff-breasted sandpiper has all those different colored tags on its legs, 4 different colors.
Yeah, that's a great question for Marian. So the colored bands and colored flags are helpful, and they're for research purposes. And in a lot of ways, they identify the individual bird as an individual. So the way that those colors are situated on the legs, or if there's, you know, numbers or letters like an alphanumeric code, will identify the individual. And so just like that banded upland sandpiper that we saw, it's very, very hard to read all the numbers on that teeny tiny aluminum flag or aluminum band. But when you have those color codes or a larger flag, it's easier to be able to identify an individual from a distance, so you can collect the data. But in general, we band and flag birds so that we can better understand where they're going and understand connections and movements between different areas as these birds are moving. There's a variety of reasons that we band birds. Sometimes it can be if there's a very small population, we're monitoring the survival of individuals, males and females, and all the information about those individuals are known. And sometimes if it's a larger population and we're trying to unravel the mysteries of their migration and where they go, those colored flags that can be observed from a distance are really helpful.
Great. Bill Allen asked how TNC is able to encourage patch burn grazing by ranchers, given the huge financial incentive to burn everything in the spring.
Well, that's a really good question and a really tough one, because it is an uphill battle. I mean, so on our preserves, the Tallgrass National Prairie Preserve, which is actually owned by the Nature Conservancy, but run by the National Park Service also, is where we're doing a lot of this. So we're trying to lead by example. And we have some folks on the ground that are actually trying to promote this. I'm actually in central Kansas, but we have people in the Flint Hills that's their job, is trying to promote better use of grassland, better use for wildlife, for the prairie itself, and also to make it economically viable for ranchers. I mean, that's the key. It's hugely important for ranchers to stay on the landscape. They're going to be our best conservationists. And I'm not saying this is easy. We've just been working on this for a few years, but we're gaining some. But you're right. It's a huge financial incentive. But I believe, you know, in time, these prairie ecosystems are going to slowly diminish because they evolved in a world where they had lots of fords and different grazing treatments and grazing, different burning at a time, considering using bison, for example, how they acted on the landscape. So in the long term, I don't think the prairies are going to stand up to this. And I think the ranchers are going to, you know, realize this eventually too, but it is a tough sell.
Great. And Curtis Wolf says Kansas has used conservation easements in the Flint Hills to help conservation efforts. What leverage does this give to shorebird managers, and does this provide any incentive for land managers to enact shorebird management?
Well, yeah, so Curtis is right. There's a lot of conservation easements going on, not only by the Nature Conservancy, but by some various land trusts and the NRCS. In fact, the 3.7 million acres that is part of the Wizard site is actually pretty much follows the Flint Hills Legacy conservation easement by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They don't have any funding for that, but it's been recognized by a lot of people that conservation easements is the way to go, because everything's under private ownership and we need to work with private owners to conserve our natural world. So to answer more specifically, within TNC's conservation easements, we're promoting things like tree removal, patch burn grazing, and shorebirds are now part of the equation in the Flint Hills. You know, most of our target species a few years ago were, you know, the greater prairie chicken, Henslow sparrows and things like that. But now shorebird species, the ones that we had talked about, are now part of that equation.
Margie Stewart asked, how about the more wooded northern Flint Hills? Is there anything going on to protect shorebirds there? Is there anything that can be done around ponds and streams, or how about around bottom ground?
Okay, well, that map that shows that we had with the results of our survey show most of the use, 90% of the use by American golden plovers and buff-breasted and sandpiper is in the southern Flint Hills. The reason for that is those areas that we found them in were very little development, wide open expanses, kind of like you see on the screen here, and very few trees. And the reason for that is that shorebirds, you know, shorebirds don't like visual obstructions like trees and buildings and stuff like that. So, just like you said, up there in the northern Flint Hills, where we got more population, more fragmentation because of acreages and more tree growth along the rivers and streams, that's why we don't see them there. Historically, they were probably more up there. So one thing we have been promoting for the Flint Hills, it should be a mostly treeless ecosystem. And so removing trees, even along streams and things like that, is something that does help shorebirds in the long run.
Great. Margie also asked if there is any public funding to incentivize patch burning, things like the Farm Bill. Does that help with that, G?
Well, of course, as you probably figured out, I'm a shorebird biologist and I'm not much on the Farm Bill. And so that's actually a question for probably our people in the Flint Hills. But I know that we work consistently in the Farm Bill and through other programs, EQIP and things like that, to provide more incentive to patch burn graze or do other things like that. Our easements, you know, that's within our easements, that's a requirement to do certain things, you know, but yeah, we're working in that realm all the time, and it's kind of a tough battle, but we keep working at it because it needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. And there's also partner biologists or private lands biologists that work for the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and their job is to connect with private lands and ranchers, you know, all over the country. And so there are some that are working in the Flint Hills, and they can provide answers to very specific questions about like what kind of incentives are there specifically for if you happen to be, you know, a rancher in the Flint Hills looking for opportunities. So there's a variety of different ways that you can get access to that information. So, you know, there's TNC staff that are working on the ground, and there's partners biologists through Fish and Wildlife Service, and also NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service Farm Bill program, like you suggested.
We've got a couple of questions coming about wind farms and wind turbines and how they may impact shorebirds. Beth says that she heard that they discouraged grassland birds. We might talk about that a little bit.
Want to handle that one, Monica?
I can give it a shot. So wind farms, even just the development of wind farms can cause a lot of disturbance in an area. So in order to develop a wind farm, you need to put in roads, which can dissect and bisect what was once large tracts of land, and it can really change the landscape. There have been wind farms in areas further north in Saskatchewan, in Canada, and there have been strong efforts because there were proposed wind farms that were very close to a wizard site that was important for shorebirds, and there were efforts to push those wind farms a bit further away. And so there's really these efforts to sort of what we call sort of site it right. So move wind farms away from areas where it's extremely likely that they're going to have a big impact on shorebirds, and then try to find areas that are going to have a lower impact on wildlife. And so I think it's just really important that biologists are part of the discussion when thinking about where to put wind farms like that.
All right. Well, I think
That looks like we did it.
I know. I think y'all answered every single question.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Abby, for fielding those questions for us. And thanks for everyone for listening, for tuning in on a Wednesday evening, for your commitment to learning about shorebirds and chatting with us. Both Robert and I are easily found online, and we have, should have put this up earlier. So these are our websites for our organizations, for the Nature Conservancy on the left and for Manomet on the right. And so feel free to explore those. We'll also be following up this webinar with an email, with a survey, so you can let us know how we did and some additional information and links so you can learn even more. So thanks so much.
I want to just emphasize what Monica said. I love getting emails asking questions about shorebirds. I get questions about turkeys and everything else. So, geez, just if anything, you know, I mean, my specialty is shorebirds. You've got any questions, anytime, well, anytime, night or day, you could email me. I'm not going to answer you, but I'll answer you pretty quick, you know, so always feel free to contact me about those kind of questions.
Clearly, this is something we're all passionate about and something important to us. So we're excited to share it with you. So thanks so much, everybody, and take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.